Okay, well, let's officially start. Good afternoon, colleagues and guests. I'm really delighted to extend a warm welcome to all of you as we gather for today's expanded virtual brown bag session. I think I know everybody who's in the room right now, but just in case, my name is Alex Wiseman. I have the honor of representing both the Texas Tech University Educational Leadership Policy Program, as well as the Center for Innovative Research and Change Leadership in Education. These are the two entities that sponsor the expanded virtual brown bag series, and we're really happy to have you joining us. So thank you. We are featuring Dr. Would you like for me to call you Mimi or Maryellen?
Both.
Okay. Dr. Schaub. Dr. Schaub is joining us today. Just before we get started, I wanted to let those of you who are here know that the expanded virtual brown bag series is part of Circles. That's the center's commitment to developing an environment of innovation, research, learning, and collaboration that we hope extends locally, regionally, nationally, internationally through our live virtual brown bags, as well as the recording that will be available probably in the next day or two on our website. I also ask that if you haven't already done so, I don't know how you got here. I'm glad you're here. But if you are interested in more of these talks, we have more coming up this semester. If you Google TTU Expanded, our website should be one of the first items in the results list. Please register for as many of our upcoming virtual brown bags as you can. We want to see you there. In fact, our next brown bag will be on March 19th with Dr. Floyd Beecham, talking about migration, segregation, and education, specifically related to Black educational leaders and teachers who attended segregated schools and then taught in more integrated settings after what he's referring to as the Great Migration. I'll also ask you if you have any questions or comments. You're welcome to put those in the chat. They will be there throughout the duration, and we can get to them after Dr. Schaub has finished her presentation. After she's done that, feel free to unmute, and you can ask questions that way or make comments. Let's see what else. Okay, so let me just say how happy I am that Dr. Schaub is joining us today. Dr. Schaub is a sociologist of education. And as a sociologist of education, she's also an associate professor of education policy studies and the professor in charge, which always sounds really important, of the education theory and policy program at
Until
Penn.
you know.
She's also affiliated there with the Comparative International Education Program and a couple of other child-related study centers and early childhood education. She has a Ph.D. in sociology from Penn State in 2004, and both her master's and bachelor's degrees in sociology from the Catholic University of America. Prior to receiving her Ph.D., she lived in Washington, D.C., where she held a variety of research positions in both U.S. and comparative sociology of education. Her most recent book is titled Motherhood, Childhood, and Parenting in an Age of Education and Invited Invasion, which obviously I think she's going to talk more about today, which we're excited about. And broadly defined, she studies the social construction of childhood both comparatively and within the U.S., especially since 1950. So without further ado, it is my genuine pleasure to welcome you, Dr. Schaub, to our virtual brown bag session today. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah. Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to be here and to talk about my book. It was interesting. I was actually chuckling that I hadn't talked about my book in several months. And so it came out just about a year ago. And so this is kind of a nice way for me to rethink about the book prior to the conference that Alex and I are going to next week, when I'll have to talk about it even more. So I am going to share my screen. I actually come to this work in this interesting way. And what you'll see in a second is, you can go to the second slide, Alex, and you'll see this image that I find really thoughtful and engaging. And a lot of my work looks at cultural artifacts. I like to think about what cultural artifacts mean. And in this case, quite humorously, New Yorker cartoons. And so the image is of a, is it opening, Alex? No?
I'm getting there. I had to log in.
Sorry. And so the image is of this giant baby wearing a backpack and with school stuff. And he's holding the hands of two miniature parents. And I love this image because it really made me start to think, like, what is it trying to convey about society? What exactly has changed? And yet I felt I identified with it also so closely as a young parent with young school-age children. When the cartoon came out, I thought, yeah, this is exactly how I feel. Like, schooling is this huge part of the lives of our children, and that I hadn't really and so you can go to the second one.
There we go.
I hadn't there we go. And so I hadn't really thought through as a sociologist prior to that what I thought exactly was the role of schooling in childhood. I had been a sociologist of education for many years, but I had started in a different area of sociology of education. And then I had slowly moved into thinking about parenting in childhood. But when my children reached school, I really started to think about what has changed culturally and what exactly is the role of schooling in childhood. I actually am a child, one of 8 children. I'm number 6. And, in my own childhood, I had exactly one memory of a parent reading to me. One time, I have a very clear memory of my father collecting all of the 8 children in the family room, and he read from the middle of this encyclopedia that had a little children's section. And so that is my only memory of a child of a parent reading to me as a child. And yet, as a young parent with young children, I read to my kids every day. I've had these different ideas of how I should engage them cognitively. And so I knew that something important had changed in childhood, that somehow cognition had become a bigger and bigger player in in the way we constructed childhood. But then I started to notice new things, like parents would say to me when our kids were toddlers, 1 and 2 years old, "Oh, he has 150 words now," or she understands 1 and 2, that they're separate things, and 2 ones equals 2, and things like that. Parents were monitoring childhood in such a close, careful way that I really became fascinated with what is it about schooling that has really entered into the family domain. So, okay, so go ahead to the next one. And so, as I was telling you, I love cultural artifacts. And so one of the first things I did was to try and think a little bit like an art historian. And art historians love to look at paintings and try and imagine what life was like and what the cultural meaning of art is. And so one of the things I started to note that art historians had spoken about, and that I became fascinated with, was this transformation of the mother role in famous or in medieval art and Renaissance art. And so what you see here is Mary as a heavenly queen, and there's a very formal relationship. You can see on the left-hand side a very formal relationship between mother and child. And then just a short historical period later, 200 years later, you see this dramatic transformation of Mary into a very different kind of parent. And I really liked thinking about what it was that artists of the time were thinking about parenting. How had it changed in this really short period of time? So what you can see here is a mother that is devoted, that is focused on the child, that is adoring. And you can see a relationship in the right-hand art of a playful relationship and an intimate relationship and a Ginger and kind of tender relationship between mother and child. And so this idea that parenting had changed in this relatively short period of time really fascinated me. Like, what was it culturally that was happening that really transformed the idea of the relationship between mother and child, and motherhood by itself, and childhood independent of the relationship? So you can move on again to the next one. And one of the things that that also stood out to me in art of that time period was a very special kind of painting, and it's called a Madonna Lactans, or a Nursing Mary. And it's interesting that there were Nursing Marys at this time, because wet nursing was a real was a common behavior. Women would have to nurse other people's children. So it was a way for women to have an occupation, to make money. It was a way for very wealthy women to, if she did not have to nurse her own child, that she could actually ovulate earlier after having a child, in order to produce multiple heirs, in hopes that one or more children would survive early childhood. And so artists actually representing a mother nursing her own child was a very, very important image of a really interesting cultural shift to artists encouraging that mothers create that intimate, sacred bond between mother and child, that that they actually nurse their own children. And so the Nursing Mary became a really interesting. She's also interesting for other reasons. She actually, her breast often appears in very funny spots. If you know about Nursing Marys, or if you pay attention to them, you'll notice that sometimes the breast is on her shoulder, in the middle of her chest. It's actually a really interesting thing, the way in which they were represented. But what you also notice is this intimate relationship. So for example, in the painting on the right, you see this mother staring adoringly at her child. And you see this child looking to the world to kind of invite them in, that this is something that you should be interested in, something that is part of the human experience. And so this mother is a representation of a mother as kind of offering the sustenance of life, of giving the sustenance of life to her child. So it's a very different kind of relationship than the very first painting you saw in the last slide on the left, where it's a very formal relationship and there seems to be some distance between the mother and child. This is a much more intimate relationship. Okay, so go ahead. And so I became really interested in this idea of the social construction of parenting and the social construction of childhood. And you've probably heard this term before from Alex, neo-institutionalism. I like to think about institutions in society and how they intertwine and overlap, and what the power of institutions in society. And one of the things that I'm very interested in is this graph. I think this graph tells us lots and lots about human society. And so a lot of my work really originates from this graph, because what it tells us is that human beings, in this case, in the US, but it's true all over the world, humans are getting more and more education, and they're staying in school for longer and longer periods of time. And that means schooling is a really powerful institution in modern society. It really, a lot of things are transformed by this inclusion of education into the modern life of human beings. And so I became interested in that, especially in terms of what kinds of things change. So we know already that lots of things change. For example, human behavior related to health changes with more education, human behavior related to risk changes with lots of education, human behavior related to political activity changes with lots of education. Human behavior in relationship to divorce changes with lots of education. So human society in the aggregate then really is transformed when lots of people get lots of education. So we can see this real transformation in what's happening culturally to humans, and in this case, in the United States. As you can see, for example, early in the 20th century, lots of people already had elementary education. By the end of the 20th century or the beginning of the 21st century, we see that everybody, that elementary school is universal. And also high school is universal and kindergarten is universal. We see those skyrocket up. So people are getting lots and lots of education. And that's something that I think is really interesting, because I'm interested in how schooling changes society. Lots of research that we think about and that we read about are often about how society changes education. But I'm interested in the reverse, how education changes society. So, okay, go ahead. And so this is the beginnings of what I'm really, really interested in, that one of the things that education really changes is motherhood. And this is one way in which to represent that. You can see countries around the world where women get small amounts of education. They still have very high levels of fertility. But with increasing levels of education, what you see is a strong relationship to lower levels of fertility. Women having less and less children as they have more and more, having less and less children as they get more and more education. And so what we see is that, for example, women with lots of education do not have 8 children like my mom had. Instead, they have less and less children. And so in the US, for example, so replacement rate is 2.1. All women have to have 2.1 children in order for us to replace the population. What we see in the United States right now is a fertility rate of 1.7. And so we are already well below replacement rate in the US. In places like South Korea, replacement is fertility rate is 0.7. So they are really far below replacement rate. And so what we see is around the world, policies that have been focused on encouraging women to have more children have not been particularly successful. So lots of countries have done lots of things to try and get women to have more kids. For example, a lot of Western European countries have outstanding early childhood care. They provide really great daycare for young children, really great early childhood education. They supply lengthy maternity and paternity leaves. Some countries even pay women to when they have, or pay families when they have more children. None of those policies has been particularly successful. The message here is that well-educated women, individually and in mass, do not want to have a lot of children. And so it is a really important phenomena, really huge impact of lots of education, of that line graph that we looked at a minute ago. Lots of education, lot less children. Okay, go ahead. Another thing that really happens is that women are much more likely to work outside the home. And so women in the United States, for example, you see on the left, women in the United States nearly on par with men in labor rates, in participation in the labor force. And what you see on the right is that even, I think, perhaps you can't see it, somebody might, the photos might be in the way, but what you see on the right is that even women with very young children are increasingly participating in the labor force. And so it's a huge transformation in a relatively short period of time. we have women having significantly less children and participating in outside of the home labor much, much more frequently. So gaining economic power in addition to having less children. Okay, go ahead. And so increasing amounts of education not only change mothers, but it also changes children, right? And so one of the things that's happened is this: we have kind of this mass schooling. Everybody's going to school for long periods of time. And we have this kind of interesting cultural critique of that. What happens when children are expected to go to school for longer periods of time, when it actually when schooling reaches in and takes family time away and makes it school time. So one of the things that you see, what you see on the cartoon on the left, again, the New Yorker, is this kind of joke. Do they want to read a book? Do they want to watch a lot of television? So, and this kind of ambivalence is, what role does this cognition have in childhood? And you see that again on the cartoon on the right as well. This, are we excited about going to school, or are we not so happy about going to school? What role does schooling have in early childhood? Okay, go ahead. And so one way in which I was really interested in that was to think about how schooling expands downward. Often when we think of schooling expansion, and that line graph I showed you that's also here on the right, is that we often think about it at the upper end, that people get more and more education. They go, if you thought about it, you'd probably see that, a couple of generations ago, your family, maybe the average person or the typical person had a high school degree, and in your generation, maybe a college degree, and maybe in future generations, graduate degrees. And so what we see is an upward expansion of education, and that's the typical way in which people look at schooling expansion. Another way to look at schooling expansion is how it expands downward. We often don't think about that, but we have included more and more schooling for younger and younger children over time. A good example of that is kindergarten. 100 years ago, the typical kid did not go to kindergarten. The typical public school did not have a kindergarten. It was really included into American public schooling over the course of the 20th century, especially the first half of the 20th century. But you can still find lots of people that did not attend kindergarten. And interestingly enough, in most places, kindergarten is only right now becoming a required year of schooling. We have assumed for a long time that everybody has to go to kindergarten, that kindergarten is the first year of public schooling. However, it's not a required year most places. And it's just now states are slowly requiring it. So they financed it long before they actually required it, which is interesting. The other thing that's interesting is that kindergarten is very different in different places. So in some states, kindergarten equals 2.5 hours a day and a kind of a very soft entrance into schooling. In other places, it's 7 hours a day and really a full day of schooling. And so we have a lot of variation still in how kindergarten is delivered. What we know for sure is that it has transformed rather rapidly from not even a grade to, in the middle part of the 20th century, maybe an introduction to schooling. When I went to kindergarten, we basically learned 1 letter a week and 1 number a week. We had cookies and milk. We played in the classroom, and then everybody went home. It was a very brief introduction to schooling. You were supposed to learn how to get to school. You were supposed to learn where the library was, where the gym was, how to behave in school. And those were the main goals of kindergarten. Now, kindergarten is a year of schooling in which there are specific curricular demands. And so it has really changed in a relatively short period of time. And that's also represented in this graph, right? So that beginning part of the 20th century, we had almost no kindergartens. It actually started out as a private endeavor of wealthy women, as a kind of a urban mission. They would to supply daycare and food and nutrition and some social services to low-income children, and it had a parallel institution for very wealthy children in some places. And so what started out as this private endeavor was adopted by public schooling and slowly incorporated over the 20th century until now, when it's really the first formal year of public schooling in the United States. Okay, go ahead. So that was one way that I really thought about, how has schooling entered into the lives of young children? How has it changed? How has it transformed childhood? How has the social construction of childhood been altered by the power of schooling? Another way I started to think about how the power of schooling has altered our ideas of childhood was through child rights. And so with some colleagues of mine, we investigated UNICEF documents. We looked at a whole bunch of documents over time, starting from the birth of UNICEF to the present. And what we were looking for was how the dialogue around childhood and around schooling had changed. And we were really trying to think about how a world organization, how a leader in child rights, how it was constructing what childhood meant. And what we found was early in the years of UNICEF, the ideas around childhood were that's like 1948 when it was started to the mid 50s. The idea around childhood was very, very much about survival, making sure kids in war-torn countries around the world actually had access to food, to vaccines, to be able to survive childhood. So the social construction of childhood was a developmental stage that all children should be allowed to survive. But what we noticed was that in the documents of UNICEF, there was a transformation over time, and childhood became, through the 1960s, this idea of human capital, that childhood was something to invest in because it would help the nation in the future, that it was good for the nation to have children survive, that they were human capital, and so that education was something that should enter into childhood as but through expansion at all levels. So UNICEF was really trying to promote the expansion of elementary education, the expansion of high school education, the expansion of university education. They weren't specifically focused on any particular stage, but instead this idea that more educated children would be beneficial to the nation. But then somewhere in the 1970s, the rhetoric changed yet again, and UNICEF started to sponsor a very new idea. And the new idea was that all children, no matter what their circumstances, had the right to education. And that was a huge transformation. So they abandoned the concurrent expansion at all levels and started to focus just on early childhood education, and that everybody get early childhood education, and that all children have the right to early childhood education. All children everywhere, regardless of circumstances, regardless of gender, regardless of disability, that all children everywhere deserved education. And so again, it was a new idea about children and childhood and what the rights of childhood were, that education was actually a right for all children everywhere. Okay, go ahead. And so then I started to think about, okay, so what's the relationship between this social construction of motherhood and how it changes with more education in terms of fertility, in terms of work, and the social construction of childhood and how it changes in terms of schooling reaching in and dominating earlier and earlier levels or earlier and earlier ages of childhood. But then I started to think about what's the relationship between the two of those things and how does it transform parenting? And so, of course, I thought about New Yorker cartoons a little bit again, and you see these kind of jokes that all parents, you know, kind of aspire to have the gifted child, that to have an average child would be somehow something that parent really would not aspire to. And also that maybe parents are a little lazy in their endeavors and they could do even more, that they actually need to be even more attentive to children and to do more with children to develop children, you know, to the best of their potential. Okay, so go ahead. And so I began to think about this idea around the world and in the US about what sociologists and education researchers call the equality of educational opportunity. This idea that everybody, regardless of ascribed characteristics, regardless of family background and gender and race and religious background, that everybody deserves chances at upward mobility. And I started to think about how countries push for that, create policy to create equity for all children, and how parents push back against that and try and create advantage for their own child. So what's the dynamic between parents pushing for advantage for their child and policy pushing for all children to have rights to opportunity? And so some of the ways that I've thought about it are through, for example, shadow education. Some colleagues of mine and I looked at shadow education and compared the US and South Korea, and really noted that South Korea as this extreme example of something that's happening around the world, that parents it's hard to discourage them from trying to create advantage for their child. And in South Korea, that takes the form of spending tremendous amounts of money to give your child school after school. That is, to do in the US what we would call maybe slave-on or kumon, that those kinds of things are ever present in most South Korean children's childhood. And that the government has done its very best to counteract that by creating many, many opportunities that are available to everybody. And so the first kinds of things they did were, for example, to equalize pay for all teachers across the country, to standardize curriculum across the country, to make sure that per pupil expenditures were even across the country, or actually even greater in remote areas, to do all kinds of things that would create greater equity for students. And then in addition to that, to start creating policy around shadow education, things like a TV channel that gives tutoring after school to any South Korean child who needs assistance. And so in an attempt to counterbalance parents buying shadow education, buying this school after school for children, the government actually sponsors a TV channel that any child could have access to, or programs after school in elementary schools and in high schools where children can go for tutoring. So there are all kinds of ways that of this family pushback against equality of educational opportunity and government policy to create greater equity in especially in South Korea. They're an extreme example of what I would argue probably happens all around the world. We also know that a common thing for American parents, for example, is to move, that they think about residence as a way to create greater advantage for their child, that they actually easily move to another residence as a way to create, to get access to what they think is better schooling for their child. We also know that parents do academic redshirting. That is, that they send their child, happens most commonly with boys, and that they hold them back for 1 year if they're financially able to do that, that they act to create advantage for their child in schooling, that year is a gift to be at home and to get more mature so that they can perform better in school. We know that also that American parents are, increasingly around the world, use medication on very young children as a way to enhance schooling, so that if someone notes that a child is having a hard time learning, that medication is something that people turn to enhance child's school experience. And also, in some recent stuff, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that some parents are much, much more comfortable using things like special education services as a way in which to create advantage for their child. So there's some evidence to suggest that, for example, middle and upper middle class parents are very comfortable saying, my child is a unique being, and they need additional services that the school should supply. And that this in this way, that they are trying to create advantage for their child in schooling, that they are trying to create the maximum opportunity for their child. Okay, go ahead. And I want to finish with a couple little stories about this gang, these 3 little boys and their family. I have the honor of being friends with this family for many, many years now. They started out as subjects of mine in a research study because I was so interested in the role of schooling in the typical life, the typical modern life, and its dominant role, that I wanted to be able to think about, like, what happens when that's not the case. And so the Amish, these are Amish children. The Amish specifically and purposefully limit the amount of the role of schooling in the lives of the community. They very purposefully try and limit the dominance of education. And so for them, I would say the primary institutions in society are community and family. And for the typical American, I would say the dominant institutions are really the individual and schooling. And so they were a great comparison for me to think about, like, how do they relate to school? How do they think about it in comparison to the typical American parent? And what I found was that they think about, they think schooling is important. Amish kids get 8 years of schooling. They go to school from 1st to 8th grade, and that they have a limited number of subjects. They don't engage in all of the subjects that we would engage in, and that they think that 8 is a really important number of years. They don't think about it historically. So often I would say to an Amish family when I was interviewing families, but what about when it was 4 years of education that you suggested 4 years? They would all kind of look baffled and say, no, no, we like 8. 8's a good number because that's what they do right now. So they weren't thinking about it in terms of expansion, that 50 years ago they sponsored 4, now they sponsored 8. They actually had to be really pushed by the state in order to have 8. But they think about schooling as a way in which to create what many Amish parents said to me as a regular walk in life. That that what you want is to create a citizen for the community. You don't want to create an individual. You don't want to single out your child as special in any way. What the goal is for everybody to join in the community and to be part of the community. And so I was really interested in that, and really interested in were there any instances in which more than 8 would be acceptable. And most parents initially said to me, no, 8's the right number of years. We sponsor 8. That's the right number of years. But then if I let them continue to talk a little bit, schooling expansion even reached Amish families. So even Amish families, I had one dad say to me, yes, because I find that you need more than that, more education than 8 years to really have a good job. And so I might actually homeschool my children for high school. And that was such an ironic thing for him to say, because, first of all, he only had 8 years of schooling himself. So homeschooling high school would be really difficult for him. But also because homeschooling is against Amish culture. They do not do homeschooling. They actually think that it's important for all children to go to the community school and to be with all of the children in the community. And so it was really interesting for him to say to me, well, I'm thinking of actually homeschooling my kids for high school. I had another mom say to me, no, 8's the right number, 8's the right number. And we were in her kitchen. And then she kind of looked over her shoulder at her teenage daughter, who clearly had finished schooling. They finished at 14. And she had finished schooling, and she was home full time with her family now, working on the farm. And her daughter kind of winced, and then she looked at her daughter, and she said, I know you would have liked more. And she was kind of acknowledging that her daughter, saw a role for schooling in her life more than 8 years, that schooling expansion had even arrived to the kind of typical Amish family. And so it was a nice way for me to think about schooling, the power of schooling and the role of schooling in modern society, and its creep even into communities that say that they are not interested in schooling as a dominant institution. And I'll stop there and ask you for some questions. I'm happy to answer anything.
Thank you so much, Mimi. I'm gonna escape out of the thing. There we go. Okay. We have time for questions. I just can't wait. I have a question. So maybe I can go ahead and ask. I think this is very interesting. I mean, it certainly aligns with some of the stuff that I've learned in the past about fertility and education and sort of transitions in particular, women's lives and their labor market participation. I don't think I have thought as much as you were just presented about how this affects the family in general. But I did wonder, and maybe this is a very unique U.S. phenomenon, I'm not sure. We see in the political cycle a lot of conversation around education and parents' rights coming up. Maybe this is a topic of me being in Texas, where we have certain groups that are very adamant about this. And I wonder, a lot of the evidence you're presenting is showing how sort of the right to education. I think you even said dominant institutions in the U.S. are individual and schooling, not necessarily family. But then we have these parents' rights people who are, saying we want to take it back. How does that fit into this progression?
Yeah, so I actually find that really interesting, and I've actually tried to think about that a lot, because we have in the US we have kind of a unique role of the family. So, for example, a lot of European countries don't allow homeschooling. That would not be a right of parents. That was something that was a fault. Parents fought to have that right in the United States, and so it's interesting that we constructed that way. Another good example that I've thought a lot about is naming children. That in the United States, we have parents have a lot of rights around naming children that they don't necessarily have in other places. For example, in a lot of Western European countries, you couldn't just name your child Moonwalker, or, you know, something, you know, satellite, or, you know, what are some of the other, you know, kind of very unique names that you hear about. That there would be approved lists of names. And if you wanted to deviate from that approved list, you would have to ask for permission. And so we do have this unique idea of the family and relationship to the state, right? What are state rights and what are family rights? And so you're absolutely right. We have this kind of constant battle that goes on between, for example, Moms for Liberty and schools, right? Or book bans and schools. Like, how much power do parents have to say what curriculum should be taught, what books should, you know, what books should be used? And so I agree. Schooling expansion is this very powerful thing in the United States, and yet there is this tension between what we see as individual rights or and the state. Yeah, it's a interesting phenomenon. I think I actually like to monitor some of those things for that very reason, because it's some of the things you wouldn't necessarily predict, and then you see pushback, so that slowly we go back to the other way. So there's, for example, there's a great podcast of a librarian. She was on the Daily. I don't know if you listen to the New York Times Daily, but she was on the Daily one morning talking about book bans. She was a librarian in an elementary school, and talking about, you know, saying, I just never thought as a professional that parents would have the right to question my authority for choosing the appropriate books for our school. And of course, we've seen a lot of that. And I wonder what the cycle is going to be, that there's not going to be like a big push, and then it's just going to kind of melt away, and we'll go back to more authority for the professionals that have actually, you know, thought through what kinds of books are appropriate for an elementary school, for example. Yeah.
Fascinating. We have an opportunity for more questions. I have tons more, so I can continue to ask, but if any of our guests have questions, it's a good time.
Sorry. Yeah, Alex, good to see
Hey,
you.
Tom.
I do have a question. So I'm sitting here, and thank you for a really interesting presentation. I'm sitting here at the same place I spent basically 2 years teaching online during the pandemic. And during that period, there was so much more family involvement in kids' education. I mean, I remember my wife as a first grade teacher, you know, just in the room next door, right over here, teaching her first graders with the families there, and you know the families witnessing the instruction, and so I'm just curious. And then the return to schooling, in which kids were being re-socialized to schooling. Last year my wife had a horrible year with her class because those kids had not been socialized in preschool. They had not been around other kids.
Right.
This year is a much better year. I'm just curious about how you've thought about this experience of the pandemic, and kids, even preschool kids learning at home, has affected some of those dynamics and relationships that you're examining in your research.
Yeah. So I'll say first, I actually think that it is a really interesting phenomena that we as a country just assumed that parents could do that, right? So it wasn't so much that that parents just volunteered for it. It was more like they had to slide into that role whether they wanted to or not, right? That they had to be the supervisor in a much bigger way than they had ever imagined. And so I think that in and of itself is really interesting to me, that we just assumed that all parents were available to do that, that all parents felt comfortable to do that and confident enough to do that. So, I mean, just those kinds of assumptions are, I think, dangerous. I mean, I think that they say a lot about the way we construct schooling as so important, you're just going to drop everything you do as an adult, and you're going to make sure that you do these things with your child. And so there's that piece of it. And then there's another piece. My daughter is actually an early childhood educator. She teaches either 3K, 4K, or kindergarten, depending on, on the year. And she had, like your wife, she noticed the same kinds of things. Kids had not been in school. They had not played on the playground with kids. They were not well socialized to be in school. They really struggled with a lot of the, even at very young ages, struggled with a lot of the social interaction, the kind of social skills that kids typically come to elementary school with, or to even typically come to preschool with. And so, yeah, I think that for me as a sociologist, of course, because I'm always thinking about stratification and the ways in which it is an issue for some kids than other kids, the piece of it that I'm most interested in as a sociologist is that what we know when we look at the data is that kids, kids that were already doing well in school, they didn't really suffer with the pandemic. They maintained, maybe a little blip for, a year or two, but they really continued to maintain their same academic level. But kids in the first and second quintile, the bottom 40% of performing kids, really suffered a lot. I mean, their achievement really diminished with the pandemic and with lack of access to certain kinds of resources, like, in person, being in person in a classroom. And so I think long term, that is the piece that we as a country really have not thought through well and have not really dealt with. That there are some schools and some children who need a tremendous amount of post-pandemic help, and that we have not really we have not risen to that yet. That I think that we'll still see the effects of that for a while for those bottom 40% performing kids. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So Mimi, I would think we have time for one more question before we end, and I'm going to assume that Teresa and Becky don't have a question. So I have one more, if I can ask.
Yeah.
So Mimi, I know we've talked a little bit about this in the past, I believe. At least I'm having a memory of that. I've done, as we all have, done a lot of work outside of the US, looking at schooling and rights to schooling and sort of access and those sorts of things. And a lot of my own work has looked at gender differences in access to schooling. But what I haven't really thought about as much, and maybe you have some insight on this, you led in this talk by talking about shifts in conceptualizations of motherhood and mothers. And I'm wondering, as some countries or cultures become maybe a little more balanced about how they think about early childhood, and whether it's the mother's responsibility, the father's responsibility, or the parent's responsibility, does that sort of development of motherhood shift anyway to be more father inclusive or parental expansive or something like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And because as I was writing the book, I was noticing that very young parents had a very different construction of parenting than I did just a decade or two earlier. And so yes, I do think that while I call it motherhood, I would call that that it will increasingly be parenthood, or motherhood is kind of a universal term that can apply to males and females. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I do think that there's greater and greater equity in parenting, for sure.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Schaub, for presenting your work to us today. For those of you who are watching this online or part of this right now, run out and get your copy of The Invited Invasion by Maryellen Schaub. I really, really appreciate this. As I've said before, this recording will be available, so please feel free to share this with your students or your colleagues, or maybe just somebody who's interested in shifts in parenting and motherhood and education. Thank you so much, Mimi.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. It was really
Absolutely.
nice to
Absolutely.
do. Really nice to see everybody. Thank you.
Wonderful. And I'll see you next week.